Welcome back to our YouTube channel. We're talking with Bob Dill. He was telling us about his tour in Vietnam. Bob, if you'll go ahead and continue with your story about your tour in Vietnam.
Well, I got there just after Tet in '68, yeah, '68, and there was still some fighting going on, and I was stationed at Long Binh, and Long Binh was next to Bien Hoa Air Force Base, which was, I think, the largest Air Force base in country. And the little town of Bien Hoa was communist infested. It was, the whole place was full of communist sympathizers or communists, and they at that time the U.S. government had a contract with local mayors, village chiefs, whatever, to pay them by the head to bury enemy troops that were killed, to bury the bodies. Well, this guy at Bien Hoa was on strike. He was demanding more money, and it was monsoon season, and a friend of mine who was a battalion commander at an engineering company, engineering battalion, he came to see me, and he says, I've got 150 dead Viet Cong or North Vietnamese troops stacked up like cordwood right outside my gate. And he said they've been there 2 or 3 weeks, and they're getting to be a health hazard to my troops. And I can't get anybody to approve of me doing a mass burial because the mayor's on strike. He's wanting more money, and the government won't pay him more money to bury him. And he says, can you help me? And I said, that shouldn't be a problem. He says, I researched the thing. I've got all the documentation, regulations, how you're supposed to do a mass burial. But he said there hadn't been one since the war between states. Yankees buried a bunch of Confederates. And he said, see if you can help me. Well, so I called the headquarters back in Hawaii, the Army headquarters, the guy that ended up replacing me in another job. And he says, no, I'm not touching that. He said, that's too sensitive. So I called up my friend and I said, look, we're in a war here. You got a problem. I got a pen. I said, make up the documentation and I'll sign the papers and you bury these people because we don't want to, contaminate your old troops. So I authorized, and he buried 150 troops. Well, enemy troops, because it was a health hazard. And he said, I'll file the papers and everything. And we forgot about it. So now it's been 50 years or something, more than 50 years, 60 years. And I'm talking to my son 2 weeks ago, and I was telling him the story. I said, what did your old man do in the Army? And I said, I authorized the only mass burial of enemy troops since Civil War. And he said, have you ever looked that up on the internet? I said, there won't be nothing on the internet about it. I said, those documents, wherever, it's some archive someplace, they're in there, but nobody was interested in this thing, and we just did it. So he said, oh, he starts punching on his phone. And he says, here's a newspaper article published last year about, and he starts reading it. Vietnamese government discovers a mass burial of 150 communist troops with the assistance of two retired U.S. military people who went over there and helped them find the grave. And that's those guys. And so he printed the thing, he emailed me the thing, and so I've got the newspaper and magazine article. I don't think, but anyway, that was my big deal in Vietnam, which was necessity. Left Vietnam, came back, commanded a battalion of 1,050 people at Fort Hood, Texas, a supply and services battalion. Interesting job. Had a lot of messed up people because they lowered the standards of the draft. I had two billets in the stockade, and I had situations where I had to keep armed guards on good guys that were being threatened by criminals that I couldn't put in the stockade during that time. So it was Jane Fonda was making trips to a coffee house in Killeen, Texas, there at Fort Hood. We had, I lived in the housing area near the golf course where the commanding general, corps commander was, and they had to, from sundown to sunup, helicopter had to circle the general's house with a guy with a machine gun sitting in the open door of Huey because of death threats on the commander down there. Had some bad folks that got in the military, some bad folks on the outside agitating them, and it was an interesting. The war was going on back here as well as in Vietnam. So anyway, I left there and went to the Pentagon, and I guess the highlight of my tour in the Pentagon is I was the Department of Defense project officer for the state dinner for the POWs that Nixon gave to the POWs that came back from Hanoi. And interesting thing about that was, I'm sitting up there one evening, and just me and this, we called her Big Red. There's a clerk typist, pool typist. And she said, "Bob, you got a call from the White House," and I thought it was some clown from Clemson. I had these people always calling up, claiming they're, some dignitary or something to harass me. And I thought, I'm not even answering the phone. She said, "Bob, I'm gonna hang up on this White House if you don't pick up the phone." So I snatched it up, and I don't know, said something sarcastic, I guess. And it was the chief usher at the White House, who's the guy in charge of the whole staff. And he said, "We need some help." He says, "President Nixon's got all these POWs that he wants to have state dinner for. And he wants each one of them to be able to bring their mother or their girlfriend or whatever, their wife, with them. He don't want to take them away from their family. Not even for one evening." And we told him we can't do it at the state in the White House, and there was no room. We can do it at a hotel downtown. And he says, "No, this is their house. And they've been in prison and serving their country, and they're going to have a dinner in the White House. And we said, no, sir, can't be done. And he says, see that funny looking building across the river over there? Says there's got to be somebody in that building that's got sense enough to feed a large group of people. And he said, I called the Department of Defense, and they said, we don't have anybody. But there's a guy in the Army that's in charge of their, excuse me, that's in charge of their food program. He might be able to help you. So that's why I'm calling you. So anyway, I have several meetings at the place, at the White House, with the staff, and we end up having the state dinner in a huge tent on the south lawn of the White House grounds during one of the worst thunderstorms they've ever had up there, and everything held, everybody stayed dry, and it was that evening is recorded in a couple of books. One of the best descriptions of it. They've got a few things wrong. They said that the idea was Mrs. Nixon's idea, but the idea was not Mrs. Nixon's. And so another one said somebody, Sammy Davis, came up with the idea, but to have it in a tent. But anyway, that was a very interesting opportunity. It just happened at the first meeting that we had arranging this thing was on a Monday. Well, I don't know if it was a Monday morning. What morning it was? I think it was a Monday morning. But it happened to be the morning after the Watergate break-in, and I found out there's a very attractive blonde-headed woman served me a cup of coffee, and hand was shaking, her mascara was running, and she looked all messed up. And I remember going home and telling my wife that I said, I don't feel good about what's going on in the country. I said, I knew things were screwed up in the Army and in the Pentagon, and now I know we can't depend on the White House either. But anyway, I found out that young lady was Pat Buchanan's, later his wife. And she told me that over at BMW one time. I was talking to her over there. But anyway, that was one of the highlights of my Army tour in the Pentagon. And while I was there, I was the chief of the food service branch, and one of my duties was overseeing the conversion of KP to contracts. We got funds to consolidate a lot of mess halls, little individual mess halls on posts, built some consolidated mess halls, and did that type of thing. And I was on the menu board also for the Army-wide menu board with a bunch of dietitians, a couple of nurses. While I was there, a brigadier general who I'd known, he'd been an instructor in a commissary school in Lingries, Germany, that I'd gone to while I was in Germany, because I ran a commissary over there for about a year before I went to tank battalion. And he came over and said, Bob, I got a job for you. running the Army commissary system. I said, thank you, sir, but no thanks. I said, I've been in this food business, and it's tough. It's a killer. I said it's hard work. You got mamas, and you got all kind of things. You got mamas writing letters to congressmen about troops, food, and all this. And Army commissary stores, the families use them. So I'm just happy not to do that. I appreciate the offer. He said, well, you got the job. So I fought it for a while, and I ended up, he sent me to Fort Lee, Virginia, put me in a room with a desk, yellow pad, telephone, and one of those government ballpoint pens, and said, build an organization to centrally manage the Army commissary system. Each post commander had his own little stove that his wife ran the meat market, and the butcher prepared for her dinner parties. The GIs that the Congress thought was assigned to the store were really the wife's chauffeur, the guy that took care of the general's dogs, and that type of stuff. But it looked like, so old Senator Stennis, who was the head of the Armed Services Committee, Senate Armed Services Committee at the time, sent word to President Nixon, you either make these commissary stores more efficient, or we're going to cut them out of the budget. And so this General Bowers told me, he said, it's going to be your job, Bob. You're going to build an organization, make them more efficient, so we can preserve the benefit for the troops. So I resisted as long as I could, and eventually I got the job. And he and I, this general and I, flew all over the world and visited every general officer that was commander of a post or some outfit, whether it was a commissary. And we told them that we're going to take your commissary store from you, and we're going to do a better job than you're doing. And they said, uh-huh. Like, you know, and I'm going to have you for breakfast, you know, because you're not going to be able to do that. And so we were coming back. We just got chewed up by a general at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. And we were on a plane flying back to Washington. And old General Bauer says, Bob, we're not going to make it. We're not going to be able to pull this thing off. And I said, you're not checking out on me, are you? See, familiarity breeds contempt. And I'd gotten too familiar with this general, and we were, you know, I almost called him by his first name because we'd been through so much together. And I said, let me tell you something. I said, I've put everything into saving this commissary program. And I've hired people from all over the Army, friends and people that had been riffed out of the Army, people who worked for me in Vietnam, and I've got them hired to do this job. And if you're going to chicken out on us, I'm going to put in my retirement papers, and I'm going to go from post to post telling the troops that General Bowers is a guy that sold you out and got rid of your commissary privileges. He said, you feel that strong about it? And I said, I sure do. I sure do. And he said, well, you got my support. You get the job done. And we did it, and I ran the system, reorganized the system through 5 field offices. And we had over 10,000 employees, mostly civilian, about 100 military. And over $2 billion, and this is in the 70s. That's a lot of groceries. $2 billion sales a year, and so I ran that system after we built it for 6 years, from 74 to 80, and that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Well, it's a good story. Thank you.